Hi, it's Dr. Chandler, and this video is going to go through how to write a statement of work. And there's many very simple step-by-step guides on how to write a statement of work and that are available online. And there's also lots of templates available, and lots of organizations have their own templates and their own guides and their own training internally. And so for new project managers that are just starting out in an organization, they won't be using what's available online in these different places, nor would they be going to, any books that they had used in this class or any other class. They'll be using what exists within the organization. But a lot of organizations don't have any step-by-step guidelines, and so some project managers, whether they are new project managers or in the middle of their careers or senior project managers, lots of project managers in organizations work together to come up with their own step-by-step guidelines or templates or whatever. So we're just going to use this particular set of step-by-step guidelines in the class, and recognizing that it's just one of many. It's not like, oh, this is the best one to follow, because there's no way to predict what's going to be the best for any particular situation that, or organization or a type of procurement that any particular project is embarking on. So let's go ahead and go through this one. And you can see on the bottom of the screen there, it tells you where this particular one came from with its cute cartoon graphics. All right. So project managers, if you don't know it if you haven't realized it by now, project managers have to excel at planning because they're required to create all sorts of plans, and they have to keep updating and refining those plans. And within that context, all sorts of project managers write statements of work. And the way that a project manager writes a statement of work depends on whether the project manager at the time who's writing the statement of work is with a selling organization or with a buying organization. And the organization that the project manager is with might be both at different times. And so the particular statement of work that one project manager might be writing, they're going to have to take that into account. Am I writing this as the buyer, or am I writing this as a seller? Because those perspectives matter. So this planning that we're referring to here is not the overall project plan. That's something else in that in the ideal world that was already created. But this plan is what goes into the statement of work. So it's likely that it's a subset of that overall plan. And also, this guide says to define the deliverables. And from my perspective, the quality criteria need to be defined for each deliverable. So for project managers with the buying organization in particular, the quality criteria for each deliverable or each product is how the buyer ensures that they get what they require. So creating separate statements of work for each phase also requires that the decision criteria that be defined for making the decision at each phase of the project and deciding whether it's going to continue or not. So in a sense, that's also another kind of quality criteria. And then after doing all of that and breaking it all up and making things into phases, whatever planning that was originally done will likely have to be redone. So planning and replanning is just something that a project manager is always doing. Project managers, people who go into the project management field better like planning because they do a lot of it. So this idea of putting it into context and explaining why you're doing it and the purpose of all of this. This is also linked to the quality criteria for the deliverables and that decision criteria for the phases. And this can be some of the most challenging things to get senior decision makers or stakeholders or the clients to get them to reveal this, because there may be many things related to why they don't want to reveal exactly what for them are the success criteria, because their egos may be involved, their careers may be on the line, there could be all sorts of factors interrelated that they are looking at things that they're not telling anyone what those specific things are that they are using as indicators of success or not. So constantly making sure that the people who are affiliated with the project know what is not going to be done is just as important as keeping people informed about what is going to be done. And that was mentioned in one of the videos with me and one of the ASU project managers too, this idea of constantly letting people know what's not in the scope. And it may sound like an odd thing to do, but it's absolutely necessary and helps people whenever there's any kind of a project meeting to have these reminders of where the boundaries, where the scope is, what's inside, what's not, what's outside the scope. So this idea of calling these assumptions may sound a little odd, to say that explaining the mutual expectations of what has to hold true, that may sound a little odd to call these assumptions, but that's actually what they are. Semantically, that's what that word means. So these are the givens. So if you're speaking in logical statements, given that X remains true, then Y can continue. And then, you know, if you think of it like that in these really stark logical terms like that, and then you're filling in the X's and the Y's, that's one way to go through and say, okay, what are the assumptions? And this, documenting the assumptions like this is one avenue through which one can start to tease out those things that I was referring to earlier, where it's really challenging because they may be tied to somebody's career aspirations or their ego in terms of what the stakeholders or the clients are looking at in terms of success criteria. Documenting assumptions is an avenue through which you can sometimes get a glimpse into what's going on there if you go through these steps with this logical conditional dependencies really carefully. That is one way to try to tease that information out. So keeping the plan updated and sharing it with everyone it seems like a really basic thing. Well, of course you're doing that, right? But you might be surprised to learn how often a stakeholder or a client gets annoyed with their project manager for sharing the project so widely. And project managers get scolded all the time by their clients and stakeholders for doing just that. And typically in the end, it turns out that it was a good thing that the project manager shared it widely like this, but because people will come forward and say, oh, you know, I see a problem here, or there's some overlap, or there's some dependencies here that you haven't taken into account, or there's some timing problems, because if you're trying to do that, you know, all sorts of things can come out when you share the statement of work widely with a lot of people who may be impacted by it. So that's better to have that input than to have those individuals remain silent because they haven't seen it, so they don't know what it is. Okay, so now we're going to stop, take a breath. Take a breath. Now, we're going to go through the same slides again. You'll recognize this one, right? Make a plan. We just went through that. But this time, I want you to think back to the case study project that's me giving the video of that case study project in the very first module. Okay, so we're going to take this step by step and then this advice on how to write a statement of work, and we're going to apply that to excuse me, we're going to apply that to that project case study that I discussed. So make a plan, decide what you're doing and how, define the deliverables. So in that case study with that professional association that I described, did they actually do that? So recall that they didn't really make a plan. They were very reactionary, and they decided they needed this new association management system because there were a lot of them available, and the vendors of those systems were coming to them and saying, hey, you want to buy our new system? Don't you want to buy our new system? Ooh, look at how cool it is. And they had the new CIO, recall that, and the new CIO was, you know, looking around for what kind of big project could they initiate and, you know, start off their time with the organization with a big splash and, you know, have a big impact and demonstrate that they were a worthwhile CIO. And so they kind of backed into their problem statement about what it was that they actually needed. So that's how that's not really what this advice is talking about in terms of making a plan, to like sort of back into something like that. So, so remember then at the very end of that project when they canceled what was going on and they said, all right, we're going to start over. So they really, at the end of the project, they really were at that, okay, now let's make a plan. Like, let's actually do this in a rigorous fashion. Let's get representatives from each of the organizational units, all these stakeholders. Like, let's get them on board and let's move forward. So they were just starting to do those activities of making a plan. All right, so the next step that we just talked about is to break it up. Don't scope what you don't know. All right, so how did our example professional organization do in terms of that? Well, it might seem like they certainly did that because, look, there's this phased approach. Look, it even is using a common symbol, a process symbol in PowerPoint to indicate like these were phases, right? But remember how that first phase was defined. It didn't have any clear due date or deadline. It was just this completely open-ended cost plus fixed fee where money was just going to keep going out the door, out the door, out the door, and almost, I mean, it actually literally had no defined end date. So even though it may have appeared as if it was broken up and it was following this advice of how to write a statement of work, it really wasn't. So explain why you're doing it. Make the purpose of the process clear so that the specifics of the plan evolve. So again, this goes back to the idea that I don't know what's going on with the slides. Oh, there it goes. Sorry about that. It goes back to the idea that they backed into their plan, and so the context they built after the fact to make it, they came up with justifications for why they needed this new association management system after they already decided they wanted the cool, slick association management system, even though the one they selected did less than 50% of what their current system did. Let me say that again. The system they selected did less than 50% of what their current system did. So they were, all of that, over 50% of the system would have had to have been programmed into this new system. They just liked all the bells and whistles and the cool look and feel of the new system. All right, so be specific, setting the project's boundaries and minimizing the risk of misinterpretation. So how did they do on that? And again, this is related to the fact that by the end of that project, they really were like, we got to go back to the drawing board on this. This really is, we need to reformulate how we're doing this. We need to get this group of the real stakeholders in the room, not just the decision makers. We need the people who actually use this system across the organization. We need those individuals to participate in defining what the requirements are that we're going to use to evaluate potential candidate systems to select one. So now on this idea of laying out those logical kind of dependencies and those truth statements about making the assumptions, that to being clear about what's included and what's not, that I think at this point it's probably really clear that they didn't, the professional association case study that I presented, they didn't do very well at this either, not in that first contract that they left. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this review of how to write a statement of work, where we went through the steps, just what the steps were, and then we applied it to the case study that we talked about at the beginning of the class. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.